to this ad hoc subcommittee on welfare reform. First thing, since we have apologies from our chairman today, is for me to ask members for nomination for chairman for today's meeting.
I would nominate Councillor Crothers to chair this meeting on this occasion.
Councillor Root. Can I ask Councillor Crothers to join me? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Welcome everybody to the ad hoc subcommittee of the welfare reform. First thing is Sederunt and apologies.
Okay, thank you. I've got two apologies, one being Brian Collins and the second being Ivor Hislop. Today we've got Alistair Witts here substituting for Brian Collins. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, and it's an apology. Yes, from Ivor. Did have a substitute, I had to call off at the last minute. Declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? No? Okay, minute of the meeting, 30th of April. Can we see that as being a true reflection? Councillor Geddes?
I would certainly move as a correct record, Chair.
Okay, thanks for that. We have no counter. We'll see that as being a true reflection. Justin, you've got a couple of words just before we go on to item number 4.
Thanks, Chair. It was just to explain for members why we've got a number of officers here today. Apart from officers who are directly supporting a report before you today, we also now have established a cross-department officer group within the council who will support you as a subcommittee, and obviously we'll work closely together in terms of work around welfare reforms. So that group met for the first time last week, beginning of last week. So I've asked them to come along today so you could be familiar with who they are. Most of them are here today, and also so they could hear the debate today. So I trust that's okay with members. I thought that would be useful for both members and officers.
Thanks so much for that, Justin. Yep. Okay, on to item number 4 then, which is the impacts of welfare reform on health and well-being. Presentation by Dr. Derek Cox. There's a slight typo on the front, but other than that, very welcome, Derek.
Thanks very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to come to the committee. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about the health business. And I've brought with me my colleague Catherine Macrath today, who's one of our relatively newly appointed consultants in public health in the DG Health and Wellbeing, the joint unit that's supported both by the Health Board and the Council to promote the health and well-being of the population. So I'll just run through a presentation. I hope I'm not going to go on too long for you, but we'll try and make it relevant. I just want to start by going through some stuff that you will already all know, so I'm going to go through it very quickly because there are, let's see if I can get this right. No. Here are some of the financial effects that are expected as a result of welfare reform. And we know that income and deprivation is very closely related to health. This is an estimate of what the total financial loss to Dumfries and Galloway might be up until 2014. And you will see that it comes to a staggering almost £56 million worth of loss. And that, I'm sure you're all familiar with that kind of information. So I'm not going to dwell on it, just to say there is a huge loss here. There are, of course, other effects of the change to benefits. All of them going to pose challenges in one way or another. The idea that people will have to fill in claim forms online is a challenge for people who don't have access to broadband, but particularly it's a challenge for those who might have access to broadband but have got significant literacy problems and may need quite a lot of help with filling out these forms. Then there's the change from disability allowance to this PIP, the personal independence payment, and that seems to be causing a lot of anxiety, and people are feeling quite threatened by that change. Changes to the way that motability assessments are carried out, and already people are losing their motability cars as a result of reassessments. The whole idea that we will be moving to a single payment once a month to one member of a household, and there are significant implications of that. Some of them technical around moving from weekly to monthly payments, some of them less technical about who it is that's going to actually get this income and how that income will be spent. And then, of course, we are likely to see increasing appeals against whatever decisions are made about things like PIP, motability assessments, etc. So there are a lot of implications for things beyond health. But as I say, I just wanted to skip over some of these just to acknowledge them and really move on quite quickly to what we think are going to be the health effects of this change. In trying to review the research evidence around this, of course, the actual changes to welfare that are coming into place just now are relatively recent, and therefore there isn't anything that is really robust research evidence around the actuality of what's happening with welfare reform. But what we do have is really good research evidence from previous financial downturns and recessions, and there's a pretty good handle to be had on what kind of health benefits we can expect. And of course, we're living through these two things. We're going to see health effects of the economic downturn regardless of welfare reform, but added to that, the welfare reform issues are likely to be cumulative with their effects. And the bottom line of all of that is that we will expect to see widening health inequalities. And health inequalities is one of the things that we talk about all the time, about the thrust of the work that we do is trying to reduce the inequalities in health that we see. Now, inequalities are an interesting thing here in Dumfries and Galloway because the real level of inequality in health is pretty masked in Dumfries and Galloway. And that's because of the nature of rural deprivation that we've got here. And roughly speaking, 80% of people in Dumfries and Galloway who are living in deprived circumstances don't live in our recognised deprived areas. We've got 6 areas in Dumfries and Galloway that fall into the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation areas of deprivation. We've only got these 6 areas, but only something like 8 to 9% of our deprived people live in these 6 areas. And so when we're trying to target health inequalities, where if you're living in Greater Glasgow, you can target areas and probably are doing the right thing in terms of tackling health inequalities. In Dumfries and Galloway, we've got to tackle people, not areas. So it's about targeting people, not places. If we simply look at the geographical differences across Dumfries and Galloway, our death rate, our life expectancy difference from area to area varies by 4 years from the most deprived area to the least deprived area. But this is a false figure and really ought not to be relied on. And the reality is that across Dumfries and Galloway, if we look at deprived people rather than deprived circumstances, we are more likely to be in line with other areas in Scotland where the health inequalities, the life expectancy difference is between 10 and 14 years. And in the worst places in Scotland, the life expectancy difference is 17 years. And it is my estimation that with prolonged economic downturn and the effects of welfare reform, we are likely to get to around that 17-year disparity in life expectancy. So this is a really, really serious problem for the area for health reasons, as well as all of the other reasons and economic reasons that we know about. What are the kind of medical causes of these health inequalities? Well, in fact, they are in what's traditionally known as Scotland's Big Three. Heart disease, stroke and cancer are things that are going to be significantly affected by this. And if you simply look at the premature deaths that we have in Dumfries and Galloway from heart attack, we're likely to see an additional 15 deaths every year just as a result of the reforms that are coming into place. We'll see increases in respiratory disease. There will be nutritional problems. And surprisingly, you might think that nutritional problems associated with poverty would lead people to lose weight, and that does indeed happen in some cases. But the reality is that the majority of the response is for weight to go up. And that's because people more and more have to rely on cheap, energy-dense foods rather than eating on what we would tend to call a healthy diet. And associated with obesity rising, we expect diabetes to go up. And people don't die very often directly of the effects of diabetes, but they certainly die of the indirect effects of diabetes. And we would expect to see in premature deaths at least 10 extra deaths per year. And importantly, there are deleterious effects on mental health and well-being. And you'll see in a few minutes why I'm saying most importantly mental health and well-being issues. And sadly, we would expect to see the suicide rate increasing over the period of hardship. So these are the kind of things that happen that explain the inequalities and the expected rise in inequalities. And that's just about adults. The disbenefits on the health of children, I think, are equally important. And we would expect to see a rise in low birth weight babies. Now, a rise in low birth weight babies isn't just something that we record as a statistic, and that's okay because the babies can be fed up and they'll regain their weight. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that we know that low birth weight babies have long-term health consequences. And we know, for example, that there is increased incidence of high blood pressure in these babies when they grow up and increased incidence of cardiovascular disease. So a pregnant woman with poor nutrition delivering a low birth weight baby, the effects of that can go on for 50, 60 years into the future. Their nutrition may suffer and their incidence of obesity goes up. And with that, the incidence of diabetes, and we're seeing people with type 2 diabetes at a younger and younger and younger age. And we know that poor nutrition is associated with poor educational outcomes, with all the disbenefits of that, because poor educational outcomes mean poor employment prospects, means lower income, means more likely to be on benefits, with all of the disbenefits there. We don't know for certain, but most of us who have been involved over the years with child protection issues, we think that we are likely to see a rise in child protection problems. And you might say, why would that be? But financial hardship in families can cause conflict, can cause domestic violence, and domestic violence can spill over into child protection issues. So we think that that may be an important issue for children. And their resilience overall is likely to be reduced. And I'm going to talk a wee bit more about resilience in a minute or two. I've put a list of things here that I was thinking that there's a theoretical list of things that councils could do to try to ameliorate the effects of welfare reform. And I suppose the first and most obvious one is that you, as a council, in effect, make up the losses that people are suffering. But the reality is you can't do this. £56 million over a couple of years is not something that the council could afford to do. Now, I recognise that there are there's finances available for emergency short-term situations, and you will be using that as best you can to give the best advantage to the most number of people. But truth to tell, simply giving people money to make up the deficit is not going to be an answer to this problem. So the other things that can be done, provide advice. I think you're already beginning to do that, and you're already investing in increased advisory services. And these increased advisory services will be there to try to maximise benefits. So even if benefits are being cut, people ought to be claiming everything that they are eligible to claim, and we need to support that. There's something about facilitating people in making their claims online. And again, I know that the council is already doing some work around that. My own feeling is that there's probably more that could be done. And at the workshop that you ran on welfare reform, 6 weeks ago or so, somebody at my table, I thought, had a brilliant idea, which was to use the schools as a place where people could both get access to computers and broadband, but actually also get access to senior pupils who could help them if they've got literacy problems and IT problems. I think that's something that really needs looked seriously at, the way that we might use schools in the area, across the area, to help people to make their claims online when they're struggling with doing that. The facilitation of affordable loans rather than people having to rely on doorstep lenders. And I know that you're already looking very seriously at that, and it's the next item on the agenda. And then the other possibility is around creating a non-financial economy. And through the Putting You First project, the Council and the Health Board are already looking at the possibility of introducing a time banking scheme where people don't pay for stuff, they pay with their own abilities and labour and swap that. So I might come and help you to fill out your form if you'll come and cut my grass, which I don't like doing. So it's that non-financial kind of economy that might be built up and facilitated. And then the last two that I've got are about helping people to spend what little money they have more efficiently and to build people's resilience. And I want to talk more about resilience. See, I think that of these things there, the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's stuff already going on about these 6 things, and the Council's really taking a lead on the majority of that. And I think that's really, really helpful and productive. These last two, I think maybe are being done less, and I think that that's where we might be able to contribute to the agenda. So I'm saying, what can be done through Dumfries and Galloway Health and Wellbeing, the joint health and wellbeing unit? And truth to say, since our focus of work is all around health inequalities, we're already pretty engaged with most of this agenda. So that, for example, if we look at helping people to spend more efficiently, there is a project in Dumfries and Galloway called Let's Cook, which is dealing with people living in deprived financial circumstances. Mostly these are people who are already on benefits, helping them to shop more efficiently and to be able to cook from raw vegetables rather than spending money on energy-dense and unhealthy foods that cost more money. Building resilience, we've got projects like Building Healthy Communities, our community development project, which is undoubtedly about the building of resilience. We've got the Keep Well project that's based within the joint unit, and that's largely, but not exclusively, focused on cardiovascular disease, but I'm going to come back and talk about that in a wee bit. And for example, we are running, in association with the Education Department, a pilot project about giving people skills, giving children in school skills to build their health and well-being, and that's really all about their resilience. But although we're doing some of this, we need to be doing a lot more if we're going to ameliorate the problems that we're facing at the moment. So I'm saying, why resilience? if you look at the dictionary definition of resilience, it's all about things that bounce back to their original shape. So if you've got something like a squash ball and you squeeze it, and when you let it go, it bounces back to its original shape, that's what the dictionary will define as resilience. But in terms of the way we use the term resilience in relation to what we're talking about just now, it's not so much about bouncing back to an original state, but it's being able to cope with an altered state. And I was trying to think of how to illustrate this, and thinking, if you're a serving soldier in Afghanistan and you get your leg blown off, we've all seen wonderful examples of people who have gone through rehabilitation and who have really bounced back, and their lives have come together and they are happy and contented and productive people. But they're never going to have that leg back again. So they haven't bounced back to their original state, but they nevertheless have bounced back. And I think that that's what we mean by resilience. It's being able to cope with adverse and altered circumstances. And I'm saying that the concept of resilience has got close associations with the whole concept of well-being. And some of you who have been around for a bit will know that well-being is one of my obsessions, which I talk about all the time. You can't get me here to talk without me talking about well-being. And I think the concepts that we have developed over the years around well-being do undoubtedly embrace the concepts of resilience. And people with high levels of well-being are the people who are indeed resilient to changes in adverse circumstances. And remember that as a local authority, you have got the Local Government Scotland Act of 2003, which gives you the power of well-being. The Act says that the local authority can do anything that it believes will advance the well-being of its population or members of its population. So there is a real opportunity under the Act for you to do whatever you think is right to improve people's well-being. Now, I'm going to get a bit technical now, and I hope you don't mind that. So I'm going to bombard you with a few bits of graphs and lines, because I want to talk about the relationship between well-being and physical health. You see, improving people's well-being, that is to say, in a way, improving the way people feel about themselves, the way people are content and happy, is a worthwhile thing in itself. But what I want to persuade you of, that it's worthwhile in many other ways, not just in itself. So I want to talk about the relationship between well-being and physical health and physical ill health. And the first thing I want to talk about is this magic chemical called C-reactive protein. That HSCRP stands for high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Now, C-reactive protein is a chemical that exists in everybody's bloodstream, and it's there to cause inflammation. So if you get an infection, let's say you get a boil on the back of your neck, your body responds to that by increasing the levels of C-reactive protein in your blood. They go shooting up really high. And C-reactive protein causes an inflammatory reaction round your boil, and it gets hot, painful, red, and swollen. That's inflammation. And it's that inflammation that fights off the infection in the boil, and the boil eventually goes away. And then the C-reactive protein level in your blood comes back down to normal. So it's a really important chemical, but it has some perverse effects. And if you measure people's C-reactive protein levels when they don't have an infection, and you use a very high sensitivity test, you can demonstrate that there are people who run slightly higher levels of this chemical than others. And this is data taken from a research project in Glasgow, done several years ago, using Carstairs deprivation categories. And what this shows is the Carstairs category 7 is people living in the most deprived circumstances, and category 1 is people living in the most affluent circumstances. And you will see that whether or not you're a smoker, because the red bars are people who smoke, and the blue bars are people who have never smoked. And you'll see that smoking has a big effect on C-reactive protein, and it's why smoking causes so much damage. But you will see that whether you're a smoker or not, your levels of C-reactive protein are higher if you live in deprived circumstances than if you live in affluent circumstances. And the relevance of that is this. If you look at the levels of C-reactive protein in people's blood and see how that predicts their likelihood of having a heart attack, you will see that people who are in the highest quarter of C-reactive protein, that's Q4 there, have almost 3 times the likelihood of developing a heart attack than people who are in the lowest quarter of the C-reactive protein. So we can demonstrate that C-reactive protein levels are higher in deprived people, and C-reactive protein levels predict the possibility of getting a heart attack. Now, as I've said, in Dumfries and Galloway, this issue about people living in deprived areas isn't a really useful thing because of the rural deprivation that we've got. So I'm showing you this slide just as an illustration of the problem. Now, this is Dumfries and Galloway data, and the blue line there indicates quintiles of Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So if you're in quintile 5 for SIMD, you are living in affluent circumstances, and if you're in quintile 1, you are living in deprived circumstances. But I've superimposed on top of that people's well-being scores. And if you're in quintile 5 for that, your well-being is good. And if you're in quintile 1, your well-being is bad. And you'll see that I could illustrate this with a dozen different predictors of ill health, but I've just chosen this one. This is the percentage of people who never take moderate exercise. Now, we know that if you can take half an hour's moderate exercise on at least 5 days a week, your chances of running into ill health problems are substantially reduced versus those who take no moderate exercise at all. It's a very, very powerful predictor of future ill health. And you'll see that whilst about 6% of people living in affluent areas don't take moderate exercise, and living in deprived areas, that rises to about 13%. Actually, it's much more dramatic if you look at well-being. People whose well-being is high, about 2% of them don't take moderate exercise, and yet we're up to about 23% of people with low levels of well-being who don't take moderate exercise. And as I say, I could repeat that over and over again with things like waist circumference and cigarette smoking, etc. So in Dumfries and Galloway, it looks as if having low levels of well-being is a much more important predictor of your future ill health than living in a deprived circumstances area. And that's how we have tried to tackle targeting people rather than places. Now, what's the relevance of that? We've done some research locally in Dumfries and Galloway, looking at C-reactive protein levels in relation to well-being. And you will see that if you are in the lowest quintile for well-being, your C-reactive protein levels are virtually double what they would be if you are in the best quintile for well-being. And we already know that these levels of C-reactive protein are predictive of future ill health, particularly cardiovascular disease. Now, I've chosen this chemical C-reactive protein because it's a useful way of illustrating the point, but I could have chosen a number of other different biological markers. So there's one, for example, called interleukin-6, which is a predictor more of cancer than of heart disease, and it responds in exactly the same way as this. So what I'm trying to convince people of is that getting people's well-being better does much more than simply make them feel better. It actually gets them to a position where they are less likely to develop ill health and die a premature death. So the next question is, can we do anything about well-being? Well, this is some data taken from our Keep Well project. And the Keep Well project looks at people's well-being, and people with low levels of well-being, we offer an intervention that I have called health coaching. And this is about trying to give people a sense of control over their lives, building on their own personal assets, not telling them what to do, not giving them advice, but allowing them to take control over their lives. And we've measured well-being at the beginning of this intervention and again once the intervention's coming to an end. And we use 2 measures of well-being. This one is the Dumfries and Galloway Wellbeing Scale, which was developed locally following the passing of the Local Government Act in 2003. And you will see that there is a rise in well-being with people who have been engaged with the health coaching model. That may look like a relatively small rise, but trust me when I say that when we do the statistical analysis around that, that's highly statistically significant, that rise. We use another scale called the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. And unlike the Dumfries and Galloway scale, which measures well-being on a whole range of different domains, including physical health, sustainability, etc., the WEMWEBS, the Warwick-Edinburgh tool, concentrates on mental well-being. And you will see that if we measure well-being using that, again, on average, people engaging with the coaching methodology have a rise in their WEMWEB score after it's all finished. Now, there's a different way of looking at that. We can divide people up into either at risk because of these scores or not at risk because of these scores. So if we look at the same data in a different way, here's the number of clients who, before the intervention started, were at high risk, and after the intervention finished, had stopped being high risk. And this is the data using the Dumfries and Galloway scale, and this is the even more dramatic data using the WEMWEB scale. So mental health and well-being is fantastically improved using this health coaching intervention. So I'm trying to build a picture that says well-being is associated with C-reactive protein, which is associated with heart disease, and we can do something about well-being, and we can actually improve it. And I just wanted to tell you a wee story about this, just to try to illustrate that this is not just a Dumfries and Galloway phenomenon. This person here is a member of the Pima tribe of Native Americans. It's a very, very old photograph, but you will see even then that this chap is a fairly stout kind of fellow. And unfortunately, in this era, the whole Pima tribe have become kind of well known in North America for having a very high incidence of obesity, diabetes, stroke, heart disease. We call it the metabolic syndrome, and the Pima people have got the metabolic syndrome in spades. And what a group of researchers decided to do was to see whether or not you could put in a multifaceted health promotion program that would actually improve the health of this group of people. So because they wanted to do it as a proper piece of research, they divided this group of Pima people randomly into two groups. And there was one group, was the intervention group, and the other group was to act as a control group. Now, the intervention group got all the stuff that you would think we should be doing with people. So they were sent to smoking cessation sessions. They developed fruit and veg co-ops. They had exercise classes on prescription. We had the whole panoply of trying to change people's lifestyle in the way that would make them healthier. The problem is the researchers didn't quite know what to do with the control group. They didn't want to do nothing with the control group. They wanted to do something with the control group that would obviously not affect their health. So what they did with the control group was they sent them to a series of lectures delivered by the tribal elders that were about Pima history and tradition. And they then followed these two groups up for several years. And what happened was that the intervention group that got the multifaceted health promotion intervention hadn't changed at all. Their blood pressure was just as high, their weight was just as high, they were smoking every bit as much as they were before. But the control group had got better in all aspects. Their weight had come down, their blood pressure had come down, their insulin responsiveness had gone up. That's to do with diabetes. And what was the explanation for that? Well, the explanation for that is that the Pima people live in a society that generally treat them and regard them like dirt. They do not feel that they're living in a society that respects them, and so they feel as if they are not very worthy people. And what happened to the people that went to the tribal elders' lectures was that they suddenly realised that they had a very proud and noble tradition and that they should actually feel good about themselves. And feeling good about themselves was the thing that made them get better. So it's just a wee illustration of a bit of research that supports this general theory and general approach about improving people's well-being in order to help their physical health. Now, we're already dealing with some of this in terms of welfare reform, and I've just plucked an example out of our Keep Well project of a man who has muscular dystrophy. He's married with 2 children. There's a boy aged 8 and a girl aged 3, and they live in a 3-bedroom house. It's not an exactly ideal house for him, but they fought and struggled to get the house. And having fought and struggled to get the house, they did some modifications to the house themselves, and they installed a stair lift into the house. And they're now being told by the Department of Work and Pensions that they don't need a 3-bedroom house, they only need a 2-bedroom house. And as a result of that, he's losing £44.25 per month in the so-called bedroom tax problem. And because he's on disability allowance, he's desperately worried about what might happen to him when he goes through the assessment for PIP. So a fairly typical example. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the housing issues will realise that if this man did move house to a 2-bedroom house today, 2 years from now, when his son was aged 10, he would be overcrowded. And so there are real ironies and problems around all of this. Now, we've been able to work with this man in a way that you would expect. So we have said we think you ought to go to citizens' advice and get as much advice as you can about maximising your income. But we've also worked with him in a way that he and his family are now eating more healthily and more economically. So they're spending less money on food than they were when they started with the programme. And we are working with them in order to get them to look at the sorts of things that they used to do, that they used to like doing, but they had given up doing. And they're now doing these things again and feeling generally happier with life, despite the fact that they are facing this loss of income of £44 a month. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about helping people to build their resilience. So we can't give them their £44, £25 a month back, but we can help them to feel better about being in that worse situation. And we are doing that. I said earlier on in my presentation that we should be doing more stuff. And I've tried to produce a list of the sort of things that I think we should be doing more of, or doing stuff that we're not doing at all at the moment. So I've mentioned the pilot scheme around the skills-based health and well-being in schools. And it would be really nice, because that's evaluating very well at the moment, it would be great to be able to roll that out across Dumfries and Galloway. We've got looked after children who we are all corporate parents for, and yet I don't think that we are doing nearly enough to look after the health and well-being of these children. And we ought to be doing much more, and much more of the sort of health coaching type of intervention that I've described. These children, we know, have got very poor educational outcomes. It means that their job prospects are poor. It means that they are the very people that are going to be the future claimants of welfare. And so I think that we need to be putting in much more effort to the health and well-being and achievements of our looked after children. I've mentioned the Let's Cook project. It is staggering along year on year with non-recurring funding, and we don't know when the next tranche of money is going to come from. And it's evaluating so well that my ambition would be to make this a permanently funded project because it's doing so much good. In terms of getting people to eat more healthily and for less money, I think that we should be supporting the allotment movement, and we have a joint health board and council agreed strategy for food and nutrition, which recommends the supporting of an allotment movement in Dumfries and Galloway. And I think that now is the time to be doing more about that. There's some recurring money available that I have in funds that I've got that could buy bits of fencing and bits of tools, but we need land to open up allotments, and that's the biggest stumbling block. I think we need to do more of the community development work that we're doing at the moment. For example, with building healthy communities. So that, for example, in the whole of the Stewartry, we don't have a community development worker at all. And yet there are very many deprived people living in that community. The Keep Well project that I've spoken about, at the moment, it has got to concentrate on the age group from 45 to 65. And concentrating on that age group, it is able to deal with 1,000 people a year, but it couldn't expand that 1,000 people a year without the whole project being expanded. So if we want to get that type of intervention into a wider client group, including people on welfare benefits, we would need to expand that. We are just beginning to do a little bit of work through the Keep Well project with carers who are out with the Keep Well age group, but that's funded again on a non-recurring basis through Putting You First funding, the Change Fund. So that will be funded for 2 years, but how that's going to be kept going after that 2-year period is not clear to me. And two groups that I think that we are not paying any attention to in terms of their health and well-being at the moment, which I think we definitely need to be paying attention to, are veterans, the squaddies that come home from Afghanistan and often end up unemployed, on welfare, in prison. We need to be doing much, much more for that group in terms of reducing health inequalities. And then there are people who go through the court system and end up on community sentences. And you may think that most of these people are bad people, but my experience is that most of these people are perfectly good and ordinary people who need a huge amount of help and help to support their health and well-being. And the sorts of things that we might do that would support their health and well-being, we believe would actually reduce reoffending as well. So there's a whole lot of stuff there that I think that we ought to be doing that at the moment we can't do. So the question is then, what would all that cost? This wee man is delivering a talk and he's saying, whenever something goes wrong, the first question we must ask ourselves is, can this problem be fixed with duct tape? And I'm here to tell you that all of these problems that I've outlined can't be fixed with duct tape. And just doing a very quick, rough and ready back of the envelope type calculation, I estimate that what I've just outlined there would cost about £1.11 million per year. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thanks very much for that very informative presentation. We'll open it up to members first. Members, have any questions? Councillor Gerris, then Smith.
It's one that is comparatively focused, Chairman. Let me say first of all, I echo your sentiments. At Dr. Cox's presentation, but one which interests me, in particular point you made was the concept of time banking, and it seemed to me, in fact, that the example he gave was not too far removed from sort of typical Let's type project or illustration. Now we do have, or we certainly had comparatively recently, a Let's scheme in the Newton Stewart area. The thrust of my question to you would be that would you be prepared to sort of recognise and to build to try to operate in a complementary fashion with existing such schemes, developing the concept of time banking that you've indicated that the NHS Dumfries and Galloway would be keen to develop or are in the process of developing?
Yeah, I think the whole concept of time banking is one that is of our time now. It really needs to be developed. It's not a new concept, and as you're indicating, it's not even a new concept for Dumfries and Galloway. And so, for example, there is a small time banking scheme already in existence in Moffat, where I live. But it's a small scheme, and the scheme that you're talking about is a small scheme. And I think that we really need to try to roll this out across the community and make it available to everybody. And the scheme that is on the books at the moment, it hasn't been yet fully agreed and it hasn't yet secured its full funding. But we are looking at the possibility of employing a couple of paid coordinators to get the whole time banking scheme up and running. And it's something that can probably be done on a non-recurring basis, because the whole concept of time banking lends itself to being self-sustaining. So once we've been able to support the establishment of these organisations over a couple of years' time with paid employees doing that, the people providing the time banking system should themselves be able to support it. So it's an interesting scheme. It's one that I think we ought to promote. And it's one of the very few things that we can actually do probably on a non-recurring basis.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Smith.
Thanks very much, Chair. I've always thought this government could seriously damage your health. Now I've got a doctor backing me up on that, and I think, I want to echo the Chair's comments that I think that was a really informative presentation. I think it would be helpful to have copies of that circulated to members, because I think there's one or two, quite a few of the suggestions in there that I would certainly like to see pursued in terms of how we mitigate against some of the changes that are being brought in at the moment. I'm keen to know what the NHS is doing in terms of actually measuring the impact of welfare reform. I know it's difficult because so many factors impact in people's health and well-being, but I'm keen to know what the NHS is actually doing to try to measure exactly what the impact of a welfare reform is on people within Dumfries and Galloway, the sort of direct impact, but also some of the hidden problems as well. I mean, I'll give you an example. I recently met with a group of GPs, and it was specifically to discuss some of the welfare reform changes, and this was prior to PIP even being introduced this week. And the feedback that I was getting from GPs was something as obvious as the way it was impacted on their workload. They were seeing an increased number of people making appointments to see them for two reasons. First of all, obviously to get letters of support, etc., when it came to appealing against their cuts in benefits, but also just a general increase in the number of people, particularly people with mental health problems, and the anxiety and the stress the whole welfare reform proposals were actually causing on them had actually increased the number of people making appointments to see their GP as a result of that additional impact on their health. So I'm just wondering, for example, if the NHS are actually going to measure something like that. You know, what is the impact on GPs' workload as a direct result of some of the changes in welfare reform?
Yes, thanks. We're very fortunate in Scotland that we've got really, really good data collection around health issues. So we will be able to monitor, and we will monitor all sorts of bits of health service activity. So GP consultation rates, yes, absolutely. GP consultation rates for specific diagnoses, yes, we can do that too. Hospital admission rates, accident and emergency attendance rates. We've got such good data around that we can keep on monitoring that. In addition to that, at a national level, NHS Health Scotland is already trying to monitor at a Scotland-wide level what the impacts of welfare reform might be as they develop. And then you will have heard me talking about some of the projects that we've got locally, like building healthy communities, like the Keep Well project. And we do keep data around the people who are engaged with these two projects, and we will certainly be able to measure differences according to welfare reforms. For example, in the Keep Well project, for the last 2 years, we've had a data collection set which includes whether or not people are on welfare benefits. So even looking back over 2 years, we've got really good baseline data about the health and well-being of people who are on welfare benefits. And over the course of the next year, we should be able to measure changes in that. And you're absolutely right. At an informal level, even without collecting the data, at an informal level, we're already hearing reports, as you have heard, of increased workloads for particularly general practice for all sorts of reasons, and for mental health reasons, and for the reasons that you've mentioned about the appeals process that people are going through.
Just on the back of that for myself, the information that you gather, all that data, how is that best shared to the other authorities? Is it through the Dumfries and Galloway partnership, through the Community Health Social Care Partnership, and such like? How is that information spread through so it's best effective?
I suppose the answer to that is it depends. One of the ways that it can be disseminated is for people to ask for it. So if this committee, and I don't know how long this committee is going to be in existence, but if it's going to be in existence for any length of time, I'd be very happy to bring back to this committee on a regular sort of 6-monthly basis any progress reports on data. I, as you will probably know, also have the opportunity in my annual report to select topics that I might want to highlight in terms of the health of the population of Dumfries and Galloway. And it seems to me that welfare benefits is a big issue just now and could very well feature in my annual report this year. We have the relatively recently formed Public Health Governance Committee in the Health Board, on which there's representation from the Council on that committee, and we will certainly be reporting back some of the data to that committee. So there are various different ways that this can be done, and most of you will know me by now that I'm willing to go and talk to anybody about these issues. So if area committees were interested, we can do that too.
Okay, thanks very much for that. We'll come back to that presentation. Councillor Witts, then Geddes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank Dr. Cox for his very informative presentation. I got a lot out of that, and I'm sure it goes for the rest of us. However, my question is probably best answered not by Dr. Cox, but perhaps officials of this council. We talked about allotments, and Dr. Cox referred to the situation where land is the problem. But of course, in this area, we have a fairly light population base vis-a-vis other parts of Scotland, so I would not think this is an insurmountable problem. And perhaps this is something we should concentrate our minds on. I wondered if any official could be prepared to answer that. I would just want to park that one for consideration, because I do know that I have anecdotally heard that people who work in gardeners tend to have a higher degree of well-being, and that's one thing Dr. Cox might be able to help us with. So yes, apart from the fact that the benefits of producing healthy food. Is there anyone who can answer the question as to whether we can commandeer, well, it's too strong a word, obtain land parcels of land for development into allotments?
I'll pose that to Dr. Cox first, to give an opportunity. You did say there was possible restrictions in what form, whether it's availability of land or how that would be the use itself. If you could maybe expand on that, we'll take it from there.
Yes, I'm at the moment sitting on a lump of non-recurring money, and I would be willing to spend some of that money on equipping allotments. So in terms of finding someone to supervise the whole project, in terms of paying for things like bits of fencing and tools and shades, we could probably do all of that. But the real difficulty is, where do we get the land? Because to go out and purchase land would be really a very expensive thing to do. And in an agricultural community like this, actually quite a difficult thing to do. Now, we're already trying to look at the way that we use health service land. There is a publication, a health service publication called Greening the NHS Estate. And under the auspices of Greening the NHS Estate, we've, for example, got a community garden based in Newton Stewart Hospital. We're developing some work at the Galloway Community Hospital. I'm just convening at the moment a small working group to look at how we use the grounds of the new hospital when it's built. because I'm looking at the possibility that these grounds, and I've got 3 ambitions for the hospital grounds. One is that they are beautiful, the second is that they involve the community, and the third is that we might be using some of them for horticultural reasons. So there's a way in which we in the NHS are trying to look at our own estate to see whether we can expand the allotment type movement. But these are small bits of ground and we could do with getting much more.
I mean, I know that NHS, I think through the Safe and Healthy Action Partnership has been involved, certainly at Eastring, an allotment project there. We have, through that in Common Good, we have allotment. So there is certainly issues that, I don't know if the Crichton would be an option in the Dumfries area, but it's I think Dumfries and Galloway wide.
If I may just come back in, I mean, the reason why I'm concentrating on allotments is that we know that there is an increasing number of people in Dumfries and Galloway who are getting food parcels. And that's really good, and one has to admire the voluntary organisations that are organising these food parcels. But largely they have got tins of beans and tins of spaghetti and things like that in them. And I just think this is not the way that people who are living in poor circumstances, it's not the way we should be eating.
One small question before you bring in Alison. It was on because it's that particular point. When you say energy dense, does that mean nutrition efficient?
It means high in calories. It's okay. You can get calories from sweet foods and to keep you going. But the trouble is, and it gets a wee bit technical, that if you eat lots of very energy dense foods, you get differences in your insulin levels. When you eat very high sugar foods, your pancreas responds by pushing out lots and lots of insulin. And the way your body responds to that is to push all this glucose. The insulin pushes glucose into fat, into your fat cells. And so it does in fact encourage obesity, the energy dense foods.
Thanks so much for that. Councillor Geddes?
Well, I did raise probably in reflection, it was too specific a question for submission, Chairman. But, I would like to go back to the point that Colin raised. I think, his suggestion is an eminently sensible suggestion that this presentation, and this is the second time I've been privileged, and I use the term advisedly, to hear Dr. Cox over the last few weeks, because we had him for nearly 2 hours at the Scrutiny Performance Committee, and it was more of a tour de force than a presentation, except for responding to questions. But moving on beyond what Colin has suggested, my worry is that, this presentation and all the good, challenging, stimulating points it's raised, if we're not careful, will simply drift away into the ether, as no doubt has happened on occasions in the past. And I would like to see us getting back, Chairman. I know that there are mechanisms in place, or structures in place, is probably a better word, as it were, whereby the NHS, Dumfries and Galloway, and the Council are supposed to work, on a partnership basis. Now, without being unkind to anyone, I must admit I've never been convinced, or particularly convinced, of the effectiveness of these arrangements. And I think maybe it's time, and I would like to hear other colleagues' comments in particular, perhaps comments from some of those who've served in some of these structures. But to me, it's time perhaps maybe for a more radical reappraisal of this. I mean, if I understood Dr. Cox correctly, what he's saying, in fact, is that, the whole raft of these proposals that he's outlined to us today could be implemented for the sum of £1.11 million. Now, that's a lot of money on an individual basis, but if you take that sum in the context of the council's and the NHS total budget, I would suggest that it's extremely small beer. And I would have thought that, and I personally would like to see both organisations exploring, and as radically as possible, whether or not there's a political with a small p will to ensure, in fact, that we do come together, we do work meaningfully in partnership, and we do expend that amount of resources, in fact, to ensure that what's being proposed here today, and perhaps anything subsidiary and supplementary, which is identified along the way, would in fact be implemented and put into effect, on a recurring basis. I mean, I've heard Dr. Cox talk about non-recurring expenditure, but on issues of such fundamental importance, surely if there's a political will and the recognition as to the correctness or the rightness or the justice of what we're suggesting, that could be achieved. And I would welcome, as I say, hearing comments from colleagues, and if Dr. Cox feels that he wishes to come back that through you, sir, Chair, I have no problems with that.
Okay. I suppose I'd like to get to the bottom of it. I mean, I did think that myself strongly about saying a political will with a small p. How would you expect that to happen? Would it be through the committee structure? Councillor Maitland, do you want to come in first?
Well, I was going to put the good doctor on the spot and ask him which he would take as top priorities. If we couldn't do it all, which would you think would be the most effective interventions, let's say the top 3, to have an effect upon the well-being of people in Dumfries and Galloway? Which would you go for if you were given a magic wand?
Gosh, you really have put me on the spot. I find that a really, really difficult question to answer. On other occasions, I have been heard to say, if we could only do 2 things about the health of the people of Dumfries and Galloway, the first would be about putting resources into parenting support, and the second would be putting resources into mental health and well-being. So you've heard me talking today a lot about the mental health and well-being issues, and then you come down to if you can't do it for everybody, which groups could you do it for? And I guess it's the largest groups that are most in need that you might be concentrating on. Who are they? At the moment, we're still trying to get a handle on how big the veterans problem is, and we still haven't quite bottomed that out. So I don't know whether we're dealing with a few hundred people or many thousands of people. So it's difficult for me to put a number on that. I think that the issues around the community justice issues are very important because these are people who run into recurring problems with their health. I go back to the schools issue and building the resilience of children in schools, making them better able to cope with the stuff that happens to them. We know, for example, that the levels of anxiety, diagnosable anxiety states in older teenage girls runs at about 60%. I mean, it's a quite frightening figure. And so building the resilience of that group, I would have thought would be quite important. I think that's my 3, is it?
Alistair, you can come back.
Yes, I certainly would, sir. For those of us that believe in the concept of social justice, I'm something at a loss as to why we should be restricting this to 2 or 3 issues. At the end of the day, what I've heard today, in fact, leads me to be even more convinced at the conclusion of the man's presentation to the scrutiny committee that there's a whole raft here, and we should be looking to implement the whole raft. And with the deference and respect to Councillor Maitland, I'm not interested in magic wands as much as I am in political will and commitment on the part of both organisations to make this happen. I would argue, in fact, that we, a priori, it's the right thing to do, and secondly, from the point of view of as it were, avoiding storing up health-related problems, and be it mental or physical, for the future, it's also got a hard-headed, pragmatic effect as well, or should have, and that's exactly where I'm coming from. And I make no apologies for reiterating the question. Surely, in fact, if there is a will, and a recognition on the part of both organisations that this is a route down which to go, we should be approaching it on that basis, rather than from the cash limited philosophy that is implied in Jane's question. We can only do 2 or 3 things. That doesn't necessarily need to be the case, as far as I'm concerned, Chair. And at the end of the day, if we identify and we afford it sufficient priority from a political and resource allocation point of view, we should be doing exactly that. As I've said, a priori, it's the right thing to do, and it also has beneficial and pragmatic effects, or will have in the future, from the point of view of the health and welfare of our communities.
I haven't got any other speakers at the moment, so in a means to go forward, and can we ask Dr. Cox, he's offered up the chance that he'd like to come back, ask him to come back with a focus on a report, even on the back of Dr. Cox coming back, give us a further presentation on, in particular, what you're trying to pick up on there, Alistair. But Ronnie, you come in before we get to go to that.
Yeah, it's just taking it forward, Ian. this committee was set up to look at how we could offset and mitigate some of the impacts of welfare reform on behalf of the full council. Now, if we feel strongly what we've heard today, should it be incumbent upon this committee to put a report back up to full council and say we've got to get behind this, taking on Alistair's point? I mean, surely that's one of our functions, is to feed this back to the full council. And I think that's the way forward. If we believe what we've been told, and no disrespect, I mean, there's no need to disprove you. You've actually done some work there and put a cost on it. Alistair's alluded to it. That's something that we should debate at full council as soon as possible. That'd be a way forward, in my view, Chair. I would move that as a motion if that's necessary, but I don't think we need to move motions. But
No, I think we'll certainly get consensus in this, but I think with Subcommittee of Policy and Resources, so it's what committee do we refer that to? Would it be Policy and Resources? But which is just as strong, I think, in this particular case. Justin, do you want to give us any guidance or thoughts on this?
Thanks, Chair. Well, certainly in terms of the issues that Dr. Cox has raised today, in terms of what can be taken forward, what can be developed, expanded on, we can certainly bring back a report, which we would obviously work together with Dr. Cox on. I would suggest perhaps to this subcommittee as quickly as possible, accepting there's a bit of work that would need to be done in terms of identifying and fleshing out a bit what we were talking about in terms of services, what already exists. And this to some extent does connect into the mapping work that we are certainly expecting to be able to give you a presentation on at the next meeting on the 1st of July. But perhaps the meeting following that come back with a report that makes some firm recommendations that would perhaps then allow you to in turn to make some recommendations to Policy and Resources Committee after the summer recess, which would obviously in terms of resource allocation be timing-wise perhaps would fit reasonably well.
Is that a good suggestion, Alistair?
Is there not, I appreciate, that it is a good suggestion, but is there not, Chair, with respect to Mr. Tracy, an unnecessary stage in that process? I mean, this committee has heard today Dr. Cox's presentation. We've come to various conclusions on the back of it. Would it not, in fact, be possible to ask for a report to be produced and rather coming back to this committee, for that report to be taken straight to the Policy and Resources Committee, and if Dr. Cox were to be afforded the facility of attending that committee and speaking to his report at the time it went to the Policy and Resources Committee, so be it. I certainly would have no problems or issues with that. And to me, it would in fact tend to cut out one stage in the process.
Absolutely fine with that. We can just clarify that wouldn't be an issue. So we okay to go with that? So, just clear for absolute clarity and for the record, thank Dr. Cox for his presentation, very informative as it is. Welcome him back at a later stage at some point what's agreeable to himself. And just the conclusion on as far as what we've decided here to be referred up to Policy and Resources, please.
Okay, thank you. I can confirm I've got a note to bring back a report to Policy and Resources, basically as soon as possible, working with customer services, working with Dr. Cox. I've also got a note that the copies of the slides should be circulated to members. These would appear as part of the minute of this meeting anyway, so fully accessible.
Just for absolute clarity, so I think the real purpose of that report is with reference to the 1.11 million and how that could be best affected across maybe both authorities, both NHS and the council. I think that's what we're driving at, was it, in particular? Reassurance, Alistair?
Well, yes, by all means, that's the resource figure that Dr. Cox gave, as I understand it, Chair, to implement all, the raft of proposals that are outlined in the report, and that's exactly what I'm seeking to achieve, to get that to the forefront of the agenda of the Council, and hopefully, get a concomitant response from NHS Dumfries and Galloway.
I would just like to reiterate that I'm very grateful to the committee for inviting me here and giving me this time. It feels to me as if the outcome that you've arrived at is a very satisfactory one, and I'm very happy to support it and to come to Policy and Resources if that's what you would like me to do.
Thanks so much for that reassurance. Appreciate it. Okay. Thanks very much. Item number 5. Financial inclusion strategy.
If you don't mind, can we just leave the meeting?
No, absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
Thank you very
You're
much.
free to go. Justin's got to start off with this one, but what I'll ask is for a full introduction to this report.
Right, thanks, Chair. The financial inclusion strategy that you have, draft financial inclusion strategy you have before you today has been a piece of work that was agreed as part of the Community and Customer Services business plan agreed last summer. The work has been taken forward on a partnership basis by Andy Reid, who's sitting here. And really what I'm going to ask Andy to do is to take you through the process through which this piece of work has been developed and we got to the point we're at today. But this is very much an opportunity for you to comment, ask for things to be included that you feel aren't there at the moment, or indeed to be removed, or to be given greater emphasis or less emphasis, with a view then to the finalised draft going to Policy and Resources Committee in July. There clearly is, as I've said earlier, a clear link to the mapping work that on services related to mitigating the impacts of welfare reform that Andy is working on and been coordinating that work. What we are hoping, as I said earlier, is that we can bring back to you a presentation on the mapping work to the meeting on the 1st of July and get a kind of final steer from you before that work's finalised over the summer. We've certainly tried to do our best to accelerate that work. I think we were talking about October at the last meeting. You asked us to give that higher priority and accelerate it as much as we could. So thanks, Chair. If Andy could take you through the...
Thanks for that, Justin. If you could speak to the report, please, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The financial inclusion strategy, we established a working group which had representation from various council internal departments, third sector partners, and some national agencies. Those organisations are detailed in Appendix 2, which attended various meetings. The initial meeting went through a process of SWOT and PEST analysis of our current impacts relating to financial inclusion in the services which we currently deliver across the region, with each of the partners inputting their feedback. From that, we extracted the key themes which we felt as a group, as a working group, that needed greater emphasis or to group subject areas together. And then on the back of that, we developed the objective outcomes, the sort of where we want to be in the region. The important aspect of the strategy at the back of it was that we felt that it was one thing to develop a strategy, but we needed a combined joint action plan with clear direction for how we deliver and achieve those objectives. We eventually created the draft document, which was circulated to our partners in the working group for sort of consultation, and we're now discussing this and consulting with yourselves for further comments about areas that you would wish to see either highlighted greater or included or amended. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Andy. Members, Councillor Smith, you're first.
Thanks very much, Chair. I mean, I've got quite a few points here, so if you can indulge me, Chair, I'll sort of divide them into two sections, with the first being the sort of first half of the document, and the second set of points we can come back in specifically on the action plan. In terms of the first part in Appendix 1, I mean, I think the point that's on page 17 about the change in the groups that are being affected at the moment, I think is a really important point. I think certainly when I've spoken to people, for example, who are dealing with food parcels at the moment, they highlight that very point that, you know, maybe a few years ago, the sort of, if they had food parcels, it was the clients, if you like, they had are very different from what they're seeing nowadays, and more families coming along, people that are in work that previously maybe didn't come forward but are in such low incomes that they're now having to take advantage of food parcels. And I think that's a really crucial point for this region. We're the only region in Scotland that's actually seen a fall in the average weekly income in Scotland over the last 3 years. Every other region in Scotland has seen a slight increase if you look at the ONS figures in Dumfries and Galloway, it's fallen from £443 average weekly income to £400 this year in the last 3 years. I mean, that's the only region to have that. I mean, the average weekly income at UK level is £597, but in Scotland, in Dumfries and Galloway, we're down at 400. I think it's a really crucial point that families on low pay in this region are having to take advantage of things like food parcels, and there's a real change in the client group. I think that's a really important point. There's obviously quite a few figures in the document. Some of them, I mean, they're interesting, but there's a sort of group of national figures, then there's a group of local figures. What I'd be quite keen to see is almost, if you like, comparators. How do we compare to other parts of Scotland, other parts of the UK, so we can actually get a handle on what some of the specific issues are in terms of financial inclusion in this region are. For example, if you look at page 19, that they've got the unemployment figures, I think, first of all, I think they're probably a couple of months out of date. They look like the March figures to me. The April figures showed a claimant count of 3,392. By the time you finish this document next month, the claimant count will have changed. So I think it's important that we actually have to put a date beside the figures we've actually got, but actually look at the figures and see what characteristics they have. So the claimant count in April last year was 3,392, and that was 3.8%. Slightly, the overall figure had gone down, the percentage had gone up, which is actually above the UK average, but that's not in the document. But what I think is really striking about the claimant count figures in Dumfries and Galloway at the moment is what's happening to youth unemployment. We've got a youth unemployment claimant count of 9.1% for April. Now the UK average is 6.7%, and the Scottish average is 7.2%. So while we've got a claimant count of roughly the UK Scottish average, the youth unemployment in this area is at real crisis level. We're hitting almost 10% in youth unemployment. There's a real issue here with young people in this region in terms of job opportunities and the way that's going. And that's certainly included in your page 17 group, if you like, that are coming forward and requiring more support. So I would like to see figures that show comparisons between the region and other parts of Scotland, so we can really see exactly what particular problems we've got in this part of Scotland. In terms of page 25, reference is made to the Financial Inclusion Working Group. I'm just keen to know what that membership will be. Obviously, I think that the strategy group is obviously listed in Appendix 2, but what exactly will be the makeup of the actual working group that takes this work forward? And I'm also keen to know who it will report to. Obviously, I think it seems to imply that that's a strategic partnership. Well, that's fine, but for political reasons, a Labour group's been excluded from that, so I'm concerned about the accountability of reporting to an organisation that frankly, in my view, doesn't reflect the actual political makeup of the council. 90% of the action plan detailed in the appendix refers to actions of the council, but it's going to report to a partnership that, in my view, frankly, is not accountable and certainly doesn't reflect the makeup of the local authorities. I'm keen to know what other ways you'll be communicating and actually will be allowed to monitor the progress of the actual action plan. On page 27, it makes reference to the annual survey work. It seems to imply there's going to be a sort of annual survey. I'd just like to know exactly what that will be. I mean, we're going to survey everybody on how exactly will that be targeted and how will that actually work in practice. And in terms of page 29 up to 36, there's obviously a lot of objectives there, but I'm not entirely clear how the objectives will be monitored, if you like. Will there be a performance criteria set up for each of the objectives so that those can be monitored by whichever organisation is going to monitor the action plan when it's implemented? And with your indulgence, Chair, I'll leave it at that, just not but come back in on some of the points in the action plan if that's possible.
No problem with that. I picked up the page 26, I think you referred to, the Dumfries and Galloway Strategic Partnership, just for my own clarity. I think that's what you're referring to when you're talking about lack of representation from your own group. Okay, right, thanks for that. Andy?
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and remember and get through most of these. With regards to the performance, the statistics at the start of the document, fully take on board the points. We'll include a table which includes Scotland, other local authorities, which are our comparator authorities, and the Dumfries and Galloway position. We'll try and get that updated as soon as possible and then circulated within the report. With regards to the membership of the Financial Inclusion Working Group taking forward the actions, you'll notice within the action plan at the moment, obviously, there isn't the allocation of who. That's something which would sort of come within, whilst the council takes the responsibility and lead on those, as a partnership, they'll be driven forward with hoping that the partners would take their responsibility and lead. The makeup of the group would be the sort of the top level managers or decision makers from those organisations, which are mentioned at the back, but we would open it up to third-party organisations once a clear terms of reference, so that decisions can be made on those actions, as opposed to having to go back and make decisions later on. And with regards to the survey, which I think was the final point, the survey, once the agreement of the strategy is completed, the aim would be to develop that survey to give the indication on the outcomes as a more qualitative feedback about how people are perceived, as opposed to generic stats from national organisations. As for the process of surveying, we've yet to sort of finalise on that. There's the community engagement officers, whether we go out face-to-face and do surveys, whether it be through surveying people who've actually specifically come in and used the advice services throughout the year. So we're getting their opinion as to whether they felt a benefit or whether they are feeling more capable of dealing with their finances. I think if there's anything else.
I think we should get Justin to pick up on the political representation and the strategic partnership, perhaps.
Thanks, Chair. I recognise the issue here, and I think what we need to do is to bring back monitoring reports, either full monitoring reports or as part of a CCS monitoring report, either to this subcommittee or to Policy and Resources Committee, to make sure that we report back through council committees. I think the other point, Councillor Smith, that perhaps Mr. Reid needs to pick up is around the pages 29 to 36 and the monitoring against those.
Thanks for that. We have Councillor Wicks, Maitland, then Geddes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief on my point. If you look at foot of page 14, you see claims universal credit introduction. The expectation is that claims will be through online accounts and will be launched in the UK in October 2013. Phased rollout completed by December 2017. And you bear in mind that not everybody is computer literate. I'm barely computer literate myself. And I just hope that we are up to speed, and we will be up to speed in being able to offer assistance to people who need help with processing their online accounts, whether they may have to go to the local library or whatever. Just wondered how we're going to be able to assist these people.
Thank you, Councillor. Within the financial inclusion strategy and also within the mapping process, the process of trying to look at supporting staff as well to support people and going through the application process, utilising our council public PCs, such as through libraries, training staff to enable not just how to fill the forms in, but on educating computer literacy. And through the audit process, we're currently looking at a number of public access PCs out with the council's current provision, such as I think Lawburn Housing at the moment are just developing additional PCs. Irvine Housing are looking to bring 4 PCs into their public area. So there's, as we go through the mapping process, we should get more PCs hardware available, and then hopefully train people on the back of that within the actions.
And we're making every effort to publicise this, are we?
Within the financial inclusion strategy, the increase in publicity and joint promotion of all of the services, rather than just going down an avenue and saying this is what the council has and then leaving the other organisations to take forward their promotion to their user groups, it would be a joint promotion and joint advertising of those services, and also to ensure that joint training is provided to ensure that it's consistent service that's delivered.
Dr. Cox was at the same table as myself, and he picked up earlier on regards to schools and such like. So I just wondered, was that taken on board? That information, was it fed back from the seminar? It was in relation to particularly to using schools, but potentially actually using kids and grandkids.
The aspect of including the schools within the audit was included within the mapping process. We've got a list of schools that are there, and we'll drive to get a full list of what ones are available for public access and how the schools would enable access at the end of the mapping process.
Thanks for that, Andy. So we have Councillor Maitland and Geddes.
I was just wondering about the buy-in from the partners. Has this been through the partners? Have they commented on it before it's come back here, as a body? Number one.
Thank you, Councillor. The partners have had the opportunity to, throughout the whole process on each of the development of the stages, as we went through on the agreement of the themes, the agreement of the objectives, and the agreement of the actions, which were all done through sort of physical meetings and sitting there. And as I say, it was small working groups of the larger working group associations that they were able to put their input in, rather than it being one large meeting where it was led or dominated by one individual group. And it was important that we had those smaller working groups and tables. The document was created and we sent out for consultation to all of the partners within the working group list that's attached in Appendix 2, and their feedback's been received and included.
Yes, thanks very much. And the other thing was about the monitoring. I actually echo that. I think it's not entirely clear to me how that will be monitored and at what level and how. I mean, there are sort of talk about quarterly occasionally, but I think we need to be clear about what is going to come back and to which particular committee. I understood from here, I picked up from here, somewhere in here, that it is to come back to a council committee, and I think that's essential.
Just on that point, I mean, I picked up very much so on the Dumfries and Galloway strategic partnership, going back to there, but the committee of the council didn't pick up on that. So is that we'll make it absolutely clear, I think, just in terms if that's the case. We have Councillor Geddes next.
Well, that's my point precisely, Chairman, because I think it's absolutely imperative that we reinforce this, to get back to the strategic level. I hear what Colin said earlier, and I think it's absolutely imperative. I have no problems with it being reported back to Dumfries and Galloway Strategic Partnership, but I think, Chair, it's absolutely imperative, in fact, that bearing in mind that we will be leading the financial inclusion working group, that there is a rigorous reporting mechanism to the appropriate committee of this authority, and I would suggest, Chairman, that should in fact be Policy and Resources Committee.
Absolutely fine with that. We have no further speakers. Councillor Smith.
As I said at the start, I'd quite keen just to come back on the action points of the actual action plan, which is from page 38 onwards. But it does reinforce primarily the point I raised at the start about the need to have proper performance criteria and how we actually monitor this. If you look at the fourth action point, for example, on page 38, it's a pretty strong commitment. I think it reads, reschedule service provision to reflect service requirements and resources available to deliver services, and that's a pretty big commitment. And how that, for example, will be monitored, that seems to be across council. It's not defined, if you like, so how do we actually monitor whether that's taking place? I'm just, how do we actually assess whether we're actually making progress in that? Because it is quite a big major commitment, and I think that there's one or two others that are very similar to that. I think point 12 on page 39 reiterates the need to actually have that performance criteria so we can actually properly measure this. There's a point on page 39, it's the bullet point 8, that I just wasn't entirely clear exactly what it meant, sort of like from a financial inclusion point of view, and which departments you're talking about and which service providers you're talking about. It talks about identify a consistent level of quality provision of service to be delivered by service providers. What does that specifically mean in terms of our financial inclusion strategy? If I'm assessing and scrutinising whether we're actually delivering on that, who am I scrutinising from a financial inclusion point of view and a financial inclusion action plan point of view? So I'm quite keen to get some more feedback on that. And just finally in Appendix 2, it makes reference to two organisations, one of them called the Deprivation Group, another one called the Fuel Poverty Group, who presumably were members of the strategy group that drew this up. I'm just interested to know who they are. The first two, Deprivation Group and Dumfries and Galloway Council Fuel Poverty Group. I'm not too sure who they were.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I'll just respond on the two organisations. First of all, the Poverty Deprivation Group, that was the Strategic Planning Partnership, the Poverty Income Maximisation and Deprivation Group, the PID Group, I believe, which was a representation from the Council. And the other one, the Fuel Poverty, is a representation from Angela Lamont with regards to fuel poverty in that in the department, which I think is planning. With regards to, I accept the points with regards to clarity in the action plan and to make sure that they are clearer with regards to making sure that they are measurable so that they are start and end points. If I go back to the monitoring process, once we are approved with regards to the strategy, it would be very clear to have specific KPIs associated to this document, which will be reported back, as opposed to within specific services, specific KPIs, along with the qualitative information to come back to say what our progress is. We need obviously the document finalised before we can develop some of the KPIs, especially the sort of survey process. On the comments of the specific actions, rescheduling service provision to reflect service requirements and resources, that really comes on the back of the mapping process, and it relates to, and it may be, as I say, maybe more wordy than needs to be, in a sense of relocating where we deliver those services, so in the areas of need or where the population demand, or where we highlighted through the process, people, and the key one is the appropriate times, out with office times and accessible. So that's what that one is specifically relating to. The aspect of identify a consistent level, a level of qualification, quality provision of services to be delivered by service providers. That's really about improving quality standards and making sure that if there are 2 different or 3 or 4 different service providers out there with regards to financial advice or income maximisation, that you're getting that same quality of service no matter where you go. So it's a quality, not so much a quality control, but it's improvement, and that comes through a joint training process and making sure that people are all going to the same training session from all the organisations. One, the aim is that would reduce some resources in the sense of having to organise 4 or 5 different training resources, but ultimately it'll give us one person delivering an information and message so that those people receiving are getting that same feedback. Granted that it's more complicated to say that's a start and an end, but it's part of the processes which are within that action. And sorry, was there a third action that you were looking specifically at? Nope, okay.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, I think there's one just small typo that I'll pick up on now, and that saves me coming back to. There is a couple of that will come back to, and it's on. I find it there's no page numbers on that. It's a silly thing, but I'll come back to you. It relates to square metres rather than square kilometres. That's all it is. Jane?
It's a bit about baseline assessment, and again, I think the figures need to be consistent. You've got on page 18 about average household debt, excluding mortgages, is one figure, and then on page 31, it's another one. I think you just need to be consistent so that we can read across.
Just getting clarity. This does go to P&R next month for final ratification, so these points will be picked up on. Councillor Garrison, I think, Ryan, did you have your hand up? Yep.
Well, I think it's right and proper, sir, that it should be, but as far as I'm concerned, the general thrust of the report, I have no problems whatsoever with it. I commend those involved in its preparation.
Echo the sentiments to release. It really was a good report. I was quite enthusiastic when I was reading it. Ronnie?
We're doing this mapping thing and we've got quite an array of partners, but we've had representations from last month, the MP came to take evidence, and we've got the Scottish Parliament coming on Friday to take evidence of how's that going to feed into this, because clearly if we're telling them things, they're going to listen or hopefully listen. Do we know how they're going to feed into this or feedback to us?
really good point, I think. It's almost part of our lobbying activity, but at the same time, it's a two-way. How does that feedback?
Chair, well, my understanding, certainly in terms of David Mundell's visit during May, is that once he's fed back a range of information that he's gathered together from all 32 local authorities, that he's then going to take that to Lord Freud, and that something will come back to us as a result of those discussions. But to the best of my knowledge, we've not had that yet. In relation to Scottish Government and the ministerial visit, Linda Fabiani, MSP, on Friday, then obviously we'll need to be clear how she's going to feed anything back that she takes away from members. At this point in time, we're not clear.
Thank you. Alistair?
Thanks, Chairman. Given Colin's earlier comments about the particular issues in Dumfries and Galloway, with all due respect to Mr. Mundell and to Ms. Fabiani, I'd be more concerned than getting feedback in relation to the particular issues which are impacting people of Dumfries and Galloway. And I wouldn't, without being disrespectful to either politician or the parties that they represent, I wouldn't necessarily be holding my breath and waiting, in fact, for meaningful feedback to come back. I think at the end of the day, we've got to build on what we have here before us today with the legitimate concerns and points that we've raised, and get this pushed on, get it up to Policy and Resources Committee, get it adopted, get it implemented, and get a rigorous monitoring system in place, a scrutiny system in place to ensure, in fact, as we go forward, that we make this as effective a strategy as we possibly can.
Thank you for that. I think going to recommendations, and we have to certainly pick up on the point that this is a really good strategy in front of us here. But Claire, have you picked up on the points that we'd like to be added or adjusted slightly before it goes to Policy and Resources for final ratification, please?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sure that the officers have been busy scribbling away the points you brought up as well. But what I've made a note of are basically the need for some clarity in the action plan, being performance indicators, measurable start and end point, qualitative information in there too, some comparator information, consistency of figures, and which I'm sure you'll the draft that goes to Policy and Resources, and perhaps a recommendation to add for the monitoring be brought back to an appropriate committee of the council, which I would think would be policy.
So, members, I think that's picked up in most of it. And it's 26, where it is in that reporting and delivery of the strategy. And that, if that could be amended there, how often would it be? Would it be 6 monthly or annual? Do you think 6 monthly? The Policy and Resources would recommend.
The report in 3.9 indicates 6 monthly, and I would suggest we go along with that. Make that explicit.
6 monthly is the Policy and Resources, what isn't actually mentioned there. Yep. Okay, happy with that? Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much. Our next item is credit unions and other banking options. Justin's got to make some opening remarks, then it's, I think we'll ask Lorna and Leslie, I think it is, to speak to the actual report if there's anything to add after.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I think I'm hoping today that the report is self-explanatory. So if I give a brief introduction, then Lorna and Leslie here to answer any questions of detail. The report clearly is giving you today initial proposals on supporting and developing credit unions in Dumfries and Galloway and to explore other banking options, but the report does focus on credit unions today with some appendix. The first appendix, Appendix 1, dealing with providing you with information on Grand Central savings, and then Appendix 2 on other banking options. But as I say, the focus is very much on credit unions, what credit unions do, what are the immediate needs of the credit unions operating in Dumfries and Galloway at this point in time, and what we can do on a partnership basis to support those needs in the short and medium term. And what the report sets out, we've been working closely on a partnership basis with the principal regional registered social landlords in the region, and looking at trying to identify some external funding that will allow the medium-term needs of credit unions in terms of administrative support and development need to be supported through that funding, but recognising that if that funding bid is not successful, that Lawburn Housing Association are launching on a partnership basis, that there is work we will need to do in the short term, and we will be looking to identify council in-kind resources, both for both approaches, short and medium term, but certainly that in-kind resources, if we can identify them, will allow work to start as quickly as possible to address some of the aims that are set out in 3.7. Since the report was put together, we've also established a further partner in the new third sector interface organisation, Third Sector First, who are keen to work with ourselves and the RSLs and may be able to bring some additional resources to the table. But what we're asking you to do today is to endorse the strategic approach that we set out in section 3 of the report, and if in-kind council resources are provided that requires a reprioritisation of existing activities and projects, then if necessary, a report will come back to Policy and Resources Committee to identify the appropriate funding resourcing approach required. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks for that, Justin. The author of the report is Leslie, I see, so does Leslie or Lorna want to add anything to what Justin said there or not?
Well, I think Justin covered it. We just probably see that the report is as a result of consultation, Justin with Lorburn, and the work that Leslie has done with the existing RSLs to establish what the current provision is, and identifying that there is a need to support the existing provision and where that support come from.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Open up to members. Councillor Witt first.
Thanks, Chair. I'm sure that most people share with me my deep apprehension about the fact that universal credit is going to be paid direct to people. Huge temptation there for people in straitened financial circumstances to use this rent money. You know, what I'm saying is that it increases the risk of defaulting on rent. So with that in mind, I was very interested to read on page 54, the 4th bullet point down. Last sentence, this account will guarantee automatic payment by standing order of rent and council tax. I was wondering how that would work. Could I have some more explanation of that, please?
This is new financial products that are being developed especially for credit unions and other banking facilities, that it's basically like a standing order, or sometimes heard them classified as jam jar accounts, where someone can have their money paid directly in from a benefit source, and certain amounts of money are hived off for bills, specifically like rent. DWP are working with banking institutions and credit unions to develop that facility.
So I take it discussions, you're hopeful that discussions with DWP will be fruitful in terms of facilitating this kind of transaction?
Yes, well, I think the financial institutions are all hopeful that they will have that facility, and you know, the credit unions will have that facility to allow them to do that.
Councillor Smith then, Guinness.
Yeah, I mean, I welcome the fact we've got this report. I think the original plan to wait to April 2014 to commission credit unions didn't obviously recognise the welfare reform changes. But the concern is very similar to what Alistair says, is that the universal credit clock is ticking, and we're not far away from that happening. And what I'm not clear from the report today, I agree entirely with the strategic direction, I'm not really clear from the report what the nuts and bolts actually are. What is the sort of quantity of the resource we're putting in, and what is the sort of quantity of what we're trying to achieve? The actual numbers of people at the moment that use credit unions in the region is pretty small, and we've got a long way to go. So what are we trying to achieve in terms of numbers? It's not entirely clear to me what we are trying to achieve here, and what sort of level of resource we're likely to put in, particularly if the Lorburn bid doesn't actually succeed, and obviously what the timescales are as well. It talks about if the Lorburn bid succeeds, we'll start to put resource in from October 2012. And it happens to be the time that universal credit starts to kick in, probably in some places. So I'm really worried about that. Are we going to be able to expand credit unions in sufficient time to actually make an impact? I'm also not clear what we're proposing to do in terms of the Grand Central Savings option. We're being asked to note the option, but are we asking for an assessment as to whether or not this is something that could be introduced into the region, and how would we actually assess that? So, I mean, I'm quite happy to note it, but I already know how Grand Central Savings work. What I want to really know is, can this be of benefit to this region? Is it something that's likely to work here? I don't know how we assess that, or about professional officers on that, but how do we assess whether that could impact and actually work in this region? Because obviously there's then a cost implication as well, and we have to look to see if we can meet that particular cost through presumably the budget setting process. But at the moment it just says note it, and what then happens to after that?
With regard to the resource for credit union, obviously the committee agrees. We recognise that there's an immediate need for, and it's a twofold approach to that. We recognise that the credit unions don't have the capacity to expand, so we need to give them that capacity, and part of the proposal is to put administration staff into the credit unions to give them that capacity, but also to develop the awareness of credit unions. So the proposal is to have a jointly funded development officer between the council, DGHP and Lorburn, to actually go and raise awareness of what credit unions can do and promote use of credit unions across Dumfries and Galloway. The Grand Central Savings note, we have had some initial costings from Grand Central Savings of what it would cost to set up in the area, and certainly if that's something that you'd be interested in looking at, we can bring that back and look at potentially what is the capacity for Grand Central Savings in Dumfries and Galloway and the potential costs. I think the initial cost that we do have, it is an expensive option, but it is, if it is something worthwhile, then we can look at that. There was some talk a month ago, I was at a Scottish Government meeting, and Scottish Government did raise some interest potentially in Grand Central Savings as a option for all local authorities. I think the other local authorities there also had looked at Grand Central Savings, but also were a bit concerned of the costs of setting that up within their area. I haven't had any feedback from Scottish Government whether they're actually looking at that any further. It was at the time that potentially we may look at that.
I mean, maybe that's something we could pursue. Those that are able to attend on Friday with the Minister, it might be worth asking that very question there. But I think it is something that we should be looking at seriously. It certainly does seem to me, I don't think credit unions on their own are a solution. And I think we do have to look at other options as well. In terms of the development officer, that's been jointly funded by Lorburn, DGHP and the council. Is that subject to the Lorburn bid for funding? And if that isn't successful, are Lorburn and DGHP still going to put funding towards that, or are we? Is this what the report to Policy and Resources Committee might be asking the council to solely fund that? And what's the sort of timescale on that? Presumably that will we have answers to that by the time of the next Policy and Resources Committee?
The proposal is that regardless of what happens with the bid, that we do jointly fund a development officer. All organisations are supportive of the fact that we need to develop credit unions, so regardless of what happens with the bid, if the bid's successful, then the funding of that post will come from there, but it is soon as we can get agreement from council, that it goes to the next policy and resources meeting to get that agreement, and we can move as quickly as possible to that officer post.
The next Policy and Resources Committee aims to do it for then, is that the idea?
Chair, I think this is a bit like the resources report we brought to the last subcommittee. I think if we're able to identify resources from within the council that doesn't require, in doing that, a reprioritisation of existing activities and projects, then we can then we will just go ahead and do that, and that will speed up the process. But if it does require that reprioritisation, I'm particularly thinking of activities and projects that are in department business plans, and that does require committee decision. It might ultimately be a social work committee decision rather than policy and resources, depending on where the service is. But we can, in terms of doing this efficiently and speedily as possible, if we can find ways of reprioritizing resources that doesn't require those reports to come back, then we'll certainly do that.
So it'll come back to the policy and resources if funding required. Can't do it within existing. Councillor Geddes?
Well, I would like to, focus on recommendation 2.2, if I may, Chairman. And what I'm about to say should not be construed in any way, shape, or form of being critical of the particular credit union that I would be alluding to. But I was involved in getting a particular credit union to spread its activities into the Galloway area. Now, that took me a significant length of time to achieve that objective, and I am not suggesting for one moment that was because of lack of will or commitment, as it were, on the part of the organisation in question. I think it was more demonstrative of the fact that they simply didn't have the resources available to them to do that. And I don't think we should delude ourselves. There will be a resource implication which will clearly be required to allow that process in the future to take place in a much more shortened, constricted timescale. And I think we've got to face up to that and do precisely that. Again, I agree with other councillors. I don't think credit unions on their own will, in fact, be able, to provide everything that we're looking for. And to that extent, I think we should be looking at Grand Central Savings background sort of model if we can. I'm sure I'm not the only person in this chamber, Chairman, who has a somewhat jaundiced view of mainstream banking and the accounts and facilities that they allegedly provide. I appreciate that what's being said here in Appendix 2 are specific accounts, tailored to particular classes of customer. But I have no particular confidence, as I say, in mainstream banking providing, meaningful support in that regard. And I would therefore be of the opinion that we should, in fact, be exploring further the development of the Grand Central Savings option, notwithstanding the resource implications that may have for us as an authority and perhaps for other partners as well.
Councillor Maitland?
I think sort of, adding on to that, it's not entirely clear to me from this report here, although I think one can probably extrapolate from other information elsewhere, exactly what the scale of the problem is and where it is. Because there will be an issue geographically as well. You stated in the rest of the report about what facilities are provided where. I think we probably also need to think about that, because Grand Central, although it provides obviously electronically, there is a greater cost if one expands out, I think, from one particular office. So I just would like to know exactly, the scale of the problem and exactly where people are going to need to have these facilities to be most convenient to them.
From a personal point, what I picked up on this was everybody else picked up on the most. The only thing that people haven't picked up on is almost a consumer protection issue here as well. How does that involve? We've got trading standards, we've got illegal money lenders, we've got scam busters, even trading standards Scotland, sorry. Have they had a role at all with this? And that, talking about prevention, making sure that we can help point people in the right direction as best we can, and they're doing the loan sharks, have they had any involvement here at all? Look at it, I didn't see it, didn't stand out to me a wee bit in 3.8, but maybe they have had an involvement somewhere.
Thanks, Chair. No, they haven't had involvement directly in this at this point in time. And I mean, I think it's a good point about loan sharks and affordable credit. And I think that, as well as part of this, it's part of what we need to do when we're providing money advice and benefit maximisation, that our frontline officers, not just council but our partner organisations, are aware of that. And we need to find ways of highlighting it where it is and how we then detect that. It's something that we're aware of. It's not just
Thanks for that. Have we got all our questions answered to now? Yep. Yes, give me a look. No? Jane, have you got anything further?
No, just about the issue of the mapping of need and where people think that these, most resource has to be physically placed.
Got any response on that?
Yes, I would agree. I think when we're looking at, who should be targeted with this, we need to do some sort of mapping exercise. Some of the difficulties around this is we know people will need to have access to this, but yes, we can do that through who currently gets housing, who gets paid direct to the landlord, so we can map where that provision is. But then when the demand goes out, that needs to be a more in-depth look at.
Just a wee question. It's just I was hearing about mapping and whether it's a mistake or whatever, but all the options in Appendix 1 and 2, especially Appendix 2, doesn't mention Annan, which is the third biggest town. I just wondered why that is the case. Is none of these facilities available in Annan?
I would assume because RBS mentioned any of the large, fair enough, they're named in the actual branches in the area. Annan's certainly one of the larger banks, I think, in regards to RBS. Bank of Scotland as well. Okay, right, thanks. Good scrutiny. Okay. So we've got recommendations then, if that's the case. I mean, I think some relevant points picked up on, and in particular the fact that this isn't the total solution, credit unions, by any means. We'll have to be doing a lot of work out with to address these problems. 2.1 is to endorse the aims and the strategic approach to the development of locally based credit unions set out in paragraphs 3.5 to 3.11 of the report. Okay, thank you. Agree that in-kind council resources are provided through a reprioritisation of existing activities, projects, and that, if necessary, a report will be presented to the next policy and resources. We touched on that as well. Yep, right. So if we can't do it in-house, we can go to policy and resources for funding. And 2.3 is to note the other banking options as outlined in the appendices. Picking up on the point that Ronnie just picked up on as well. Councillor Geddes?
No, that would be, can I suggest perhaps that that be expanded somewhat, to sort of focus more on the sort of grand senior moment, thanks, Colin, grand central savings, the possibility of developing that type of option.
Can we build that in the recommendation? Yep, that's noted. Okay with that? Okay, thank you very much. Item number 7. Item number 7 is the welfare reform and the social housing sector. I think John's leading on this, John Lynch, and you have anything to kick off with? Just straight to John, straight to yourself, and John, ask you to speak to the report, please.
Thanks, Chair. This is just a brief summary report of the outcomes of the Housing Subcommittee meeting of the 25th of April. The subcommittee was tasked with considering a range of matters that were highlighted at Policy and Resources Committee in February. Section 3.31 summarises the specific actions that the Housing Sub agreed that clearly sat within the remit of the Housing Subcommittee, and those 3 actions have been taken forward in the appendices attached. Section 3.3.2 were the issues that were requested to be considered and passed back to this subcommittee for potential further consideration. And they related to establishing more formal links with the RSL sector in terms of welfare reform provisions, looking at the transitional arrangements around housing allocations to make sure that we make best use of the stock, and the current position of the RSLs in relation to their policy for recovering arrears that are potentially due to bedroom tax non-payment. In relation to the more formal links, paragraph 3.5 suggests that that needs to be captured in the emerging communication strategy and action plan that I think is being prepared for the next meeting of this subcommittee next month. But it's a summary paper that really kind of outlines that discussion. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks for that, John. Open it up to members again then. Councillor Smith first.
Obviously, as a member of that Housing Subcommittee, you won't be surprised to know that I agree very much with what was agreed at the Housing Subcommittee, which was pretty much unanimous in terms of the actions taken by the subcommittee, but also in terms of 3.3.2, which is the other issues that the Housing Subcommittee wanted to highlight. One of the issues that was certainly debated quite heavily is the fact that we do have a different view as a council than the RSLs have. We have a view as a council, and everybody shares this view, that there should be a no evictions policy around the bedroom tax, and the RSLs have a very different view. Certainly speaking to RSLs, I can understand why they have that view in terms of, I think they point out that actually there's more than the bedroom tax will impact on people's income in terms of the welfare reform changes, and you know, why are we singling out bedroom tax? But I think that's one you can actually single out, and I don't think anybody should be evicted as a result of the bedroom tax, particularly those people who find themselves in a position where they've specifically requested a move from maybe a 3-bedroom property to a 2-bedroom property, and the RSL is unable to accommodate that move. You have the bizarre situation, through no fault of their own, they can't move house to a smaller property, but they're being penalised by the bedroom tax, and then they could have the final insult, which is to be evicted as a direct result of that. So I do think we clearly have a very different view from RSLs, and I think we have to look at how we discuss further with RSLs how we can take that forward. I would like to know in particular just exactly what train the RSLs will go through. I know they'll say it's a last resort eviction, but you know, I want to be satisfied if they're refusing to adopt the policy that we think they should, what process they're going to go through before they get to a stage of eviction. Because I really do think it shouldn't happen, and at the very least, it should absolutely be a last resort. I just think it is a publicity disaster waiting to happen for an RSL. The first eviction that takes place in Dumfries and Galloway as a direct result of the bedroom tax will haunt RSLs for a long time to come. So you know, I think they should be under no illusions what a damaging policy that would actually be. So I'm keen that we pursue these issues further. What also isn't clear, and it will to an extent improve when we have the single allocations policy, is that at the moment, if I'm in an urban house and I want to move, but I don't have enough points to move house, I would be treated, because of the bedroom tax, I would be treated as an exception to policy by urban housing because of the bedroom tax, but I would only be entitled to move to another urban housing property as an exception to that policy. There's no sort of movement in terms of cross RSLs, and that's an issue that concerns me, because obviously, you know, if you're in an urban house or home in Scotland, there's even Lorban, you've got a far smaller availability of housing you have if you're in, for example, DGHP. So that whole movement between the two is an issue that concerns me most, and I think, and it's probably an issue that I'll raise at Housing Subcommittee, is the fact that when we are looking at the actual policy, the whole issue of under-occupancy points is something that I think really needs to be looked at very carefully to make sure that and I think it's probably a point that Alistair raised at the Housing Committee, that the actual allocations policy deals with people that are being hit by the bedroom tax in terms of the fact that they're under-occupying that. But I do think we do have to have more formal links with RSLs. I don't know whether or not a future meeting, we've obviously had Dr. Cox speaking at the meeting today, whether we actually invite the 4 main RSLs in this region to speak to this committee at a future date, just to go through what processes they're doing in terms of dealing with welfare reform, and in particular how they're approaching the whole issue of bedroom tax and evictions. And maybe I'm in the wrong committee, maybe that's a housing committee issue, I don't know, but certainly I think we do have to look how we actually speak more directly to RSLs on this issue. And I think actually just finally, is that it's a point we need to raise with the Minister on Friday as well, that it's fine for the Minister to say that councils and her own political party will not evict people, but we don't have that option as a council. We don't have any council houses. So we need the Scottish Government to change the law to a stage where we don't have any evictions, and we have to hammer that point home on Friday. There's no point in saying that your party will not evict people in those councils, won't affect people in Dumfries and Galloway. We need the Scottish Minister to change the law through the Scottish Parliament to avoid evictions.
I'll ask Councillor Geddes to come in first and answer both at the same time to comment.
Thanks very much indeed, Chairman. I certainly would not diverge one iota from what Colin has just said. Merely thinking aloud, Chairman, 2.3, talking about maybe we should be looking at, to bind, if that's not an inappropriate word, RSLs, the major RSLs in Dumfries and Galloway more closely to us, not only in relation to this issue, and but the wider issues. And I wonder perhaps if we maybe shouldn't be giving consideration in the appropriate forum sooner rather than later, to maybe a formal mechanism whereby that could be achieved, i.e. Perhaps, representation from RSLs on such as the housing suburb or on this welfare subcommittee or wherever, with a view to getting them, involved with us on an ongoing basis rather than sort of getting away from the ad hoc arrangement that we currently have. As I say, I'm not trying to make policy in the hoof, Chairman, this afternoon. I'm merely suggesting it as a topic for possible future but early consideration. I'll leave it at that, sir.
I'll ask John to comment first.
Thanks, Chair. Certainly in terms of the points Councillor Smith raised, as he said, the same issues were raised in some detail at the Housing Subcommittee. In terms of each of the RSL's policies and processes for eviction recovery, obviously they have slightly different processes, and the initial arrears recovery processes are down to each RSL. They do have minimum statutory standards to meet in terms of notification to, for example, the Council's homelessness service if they're looking to take formal eviction action. And before they get to that stage, there needs to be kind of multi-agency meeting involving the homeless and potentially other services to look at ways of avoiding any eviction process. But we can certainly make sure that members are made fully aware of each of the RSL's eviction processes and arrears recovery policies. In relation to the housing allocations issue, members will be aware that we are working on the Common Housing Register, and we're confident that medium term that should solve the issue of the lack of working across RSLs for looking at allocations if somebody's a tenant in urban looking for a property potentially that could be provided by another landlord. That will be dealt with through the Common Housing Register, and a more detailed CHR report will be coming to next month's Housing Subcommittee. We're now at a stage in terms of that project where we're starting to model the potential impact of different pointing arrangements for different aspects of the allocations policy. So, for example, if we increased points for under occupation, then what impact that would have and what priority that would be given. And we'll be giving members that level of detail at the next Housing Subcommittee, so you'll be able to see for yourself how the balance of policy priorities will work through, and that's what we need to do in terms of getting it right through the CHR. In terms of more formal governance arrangements with RSLs, I think I'd probably need to leave that and maybe seek advice from the governance officer in terms of whether or not it's appropriate to invite RSL membership either to this committee or Housing Subcommittee.
Instantly popped to mind was the Strategic Housing Partnership, also the Housing Sub, and we have here Derek Cox has been here today, has addressed it in a manner that we could speak quite clearly and communicate with them. Took on our views quite easily, I thought, and that's already a way we've established that. I wonder if that's something that we could look at. We'll take advice from Claire in regards to governance, and we'll come back to members after that.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, you could certainly look at inviting members of the RSL back to present to your committee As for being more formally part of housing sub, haven't got the information to definitive advice on that. I'm willing to commit myself, but I can certainly take that away.
Okay. Don't have any further. Councillor Smith?
I think I would echo the view of actually getting the RSLs to come to a future meeting of the committee. I mean, simple thing, I think it's important that we all got information, certainly at Labour got information when we met with RSLs about what they thought the impact of the bedroom tax and welfare reform would be in terms of, like DGH, we were talking about £800,000 a year was likely to cost them. I would quite like to know, I'm sure it would be helpful for other members, just exactly where they are so far with the bedroom tax and other changes. I think it's already beginning to hit RSLs and just exactly what stage they're at, what have they actually found on the ground since the changes have actually been implemented as opposed to what they think may have happened at the start of the process. I think that would be quite a good piece of information to get at an early stage.
Getting that information through, I think it was Lorna that spoke to that. Councillor Maitland, sorry, I lost my bit of paper there.
Don't worry. Can I just ask? I'm not on the housing subcommittee, so all I could do is read the papers. And what I wanted to know is how has the matter of sharing of tenancies been investigated? Because members have spoken to RSLs. I spoke to Shelter, and I also spoke actually to Dawburn in a most informal manner and asked them about the issue of sharing tenancies. The suggestion was that was not impossible to do, because where you're coming from the point of view of people sharing costs and mitigating the impact of this, I mean, I think we've got to think about everything. It will only probably make a difference with, at the margin, but that's what we're talking about. And I just wonder whether we've done any work on that or whether we could investigate further, because certainly from the other side, they are suggesting it is possible.
It has been discussed at the CHR Officer Steering Group meetings, but only very briefly. And it was in the context of looking at making better use of temporary homeless accommodation and looking to see if we could match homeless clients, make better use of the stock that we've got. In terms of a permanent tenancy, I think that would be fraught with difficulties, but you could certainly look at doing it in terms of alleviating some immediate homelessness issues, but it would need to be absolutely by consent. And obviously, if you get into a situation where you've got more than 2 households sharing, you then get into the difficulty of HMO licensing and regulation. And that brings an added difficulty in terms of changing the physical fabric of the building to comply with, you have to put things like internal fire doors and separate and all that kind of stuff. So it would be, I think, of limited impact. And initially, I think probably what we'd be looking at doing is if that was something that could be pursued, looking initially at the homeless temporary accommodation to make sure that that's used more effectively. And I would doubt whether it would have a long-term future in terms of using it for permanent social rental.
Thank you, but it could be investigated.
Recommendation 2.1 is to note the decision of the Housing Subcommittee, detailed at 3.3. Recommendation 2.2 is to note the Housing Subcommittee has considered the issues at 3.2 for this report and recommended that we then look at that further. Now, when we get to the substance of things, 2.3, they've been quite explicit, the Housing Subcommittee. They're asking the ad hoc welfare reform subcommittee that we should consider establishing more formal links with the RSL sector on welfare reform. The reason I'm saying that is because we've talked about is a better place with the Housing Sub or with us. They've been absolutely explicit in their request. They're asking for us to create better links with the RSL. So I think we should take that into consideration as we go forward. It's how do we actually bottom that out. Claire?
Say that phrased that way because that's what so do get maybe this committee decided to formal link elsewhere.
think it's probably because, I wonder if it's anyways because the Housing Subcommittee has clear links with the RSL as it stands through strategic housing partnership and such like, and because they feel that the welfare reform and the potential impacts from that is going to have such an effect, in particular to the size criteria or bedroom tax, whichever way you want to word it. That was one of the big issues that I picked up on. I wasn't actually at that actual subcommittee meeting, but I know from the feeling within that committee and the discussions I've had in the background, they'd like the welfare reform to pick up on that particularly. Now, it is an ad hoc subcommittee, so if I was to propose, we did it through a similar presentation as what we had earlier by Derek, but from the RSLs, would the committee be okay with that? Councillor Geddes, then Smith?
I mean, I think that's a good starting point. Them find out how they wish to involve. Can't just suddenly make you involved as follows. So I think actually having the RSLs give a presentation how welfare reform's gone so far, what impact's been on them, how they would like to be involved. I think there's particular structures there. We talked earlier on the financial inclusion strategy. Presumably they'll be involved in that as well. So I think it's quite good to have that.
Councillor Geddes?
Just as long as we don't get into the situation, and I'm sure, Chairman, you wouldn't allow it, you know, of the Housing Subcommittee and this subcommittee batting this issue back and forward. You know, let's you know, focus and let's get it done.
Absolutely agree with that. Ronnie?
If we're referring to the recommendation 2.3, the part that with the ships involved and the recommendation of 20% of new units developed through the ship be one bedroom, I take it that's a short-term thing because we all know that there's no real demand for one. Most folk that are in one, like pensioners, want 2 bedrooms because of ill health problems. So I could see that there's a short-term need to deal with the crisis that we've got. So it's just the long-termness, if that's the right word, of that request. I know.
I think it's a very valid point, and I think in the long term, it's a failed strategic approach for us to take. We should be looking, as previously we've made the decision informally maybe, but look at minimum 2 bedrooms. 1 bedroom is a short-term measure, and I think long-term unintended consequences would come from that. Councillor Geddes?
I was certainly echoing your sentiments, sir, and I will go back to the comments that Jim Dempster made at the last meeting of the Housing Subcommittee. I don't want to be interpreted or misinterpreted, rather, of being unkind, to in the slightest to Jim, but, what he was proposing was, A, was pragmatic, but B, it maybe masterful inactivity is an inappropriate way of describing it, but I think he flagged up to the Housing Subcommittee, the dangers implicit in diving off down this particular path, because I don't want to talk politics, but some of the more optimistic among us, perhaps in relation to this particular issue, will be of the view that this particular piece of tax, for want of a better term, will be comparatively short duration. At least I would hope that would be the case. So, as I say, you build a raft of 1-bedroom houses, as Ronnie says, they're simply not, they're not wanted by the recipients of the service, and these will be with us for 60 plus years. Don't forget that, Chair. As I say, and I think this is an issue and a point that we've got to approach very, very circumspectly indeed.
Thanks, Chair. What obviously the Housing Subcommittee agreed was to apply the 20% threshold to existing projects. There's another SHIP report coming to July's Housing Subcommittee because the Scottish Government have issued new guidance to say that we need to plan on a 5-year basis. And one of the things that we've had early discussion with DGHP on is the potential to build into the design process the potential conversion of units. So if we are looking to build some 1-bedroom units at a future date, they could be relatively simply converted to larger units, 2-bed units. And I think that's possibly the way to tackle that difficulty.
With your leave, sir, suitably reassured by John's last comments in particular. Thank you.
Myself as well, we'll have touched on that as well. It's easy adaptations. So that's good that that's been adhered to. Okay, so and as far as 2.3, what have we agreed in real reality? Claire?
I've got, the establish more formal links presentation back by the RSLs on the welfare reform and how they would like to be involved. be conversation.
Okay, we'll pick up on that. That'll be a request, I think. Is obviously we need their cooperation with that. We okay with that then? Okay, thanks very much. And item number 8. Scottish Welfare Fund and discretionary housing payments monitoring report. This is Lorna's report. Have you got any opening remarks? Straight to you, Lorna. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This report was produced as a request from the previous committee, really to give an update on where Scottish Welfare Fund and discretionary housing payments are at the moment. As reported at the last committee, the demand for both these was, as expected, had been high, and what recovered in the report is given an overview of the DHP procedure that we are working to in Dumfries and Galloway, as well as attached in the DWP guidance, which should be reflected in our own procedures. And attached as well is an overview of some other local authorities in Scotland and the type of policies that they are pursuing when applying DHP. Volume of, detailed out the volume of DHP applications we have received, and the report is as at the 24th of May. I've pulled some figures off this morning. We're now approaching 900 applications in the first 3 months of the scheme. The kind of awards that we're making is 85% is directly due to size criteria, and we're currently running about 55% of those applications are successful applications. Scottish Welfare Fund said that the demand for that has been considerably high, and I think the team itself has faced significant challenges in dealing with the volume of work. We've taken resources, realigned any resources from existing benefits into both DHPs and Scottish Welfare Fund to make sure that we actually now start to get applications turned round in the acceptable time limits. At the time of writing the reports, certainly with Scottish Welfare Fund, we were struggling to meet certainly community care grant time limits of 15 working days to turn around applications. Because of the extra resources now applied in the team, those time limits are now being met. Crisis loans are at the moment being turned around within a day of an application, and community care grants are currently 10 days within an application.
Thanks very much, Chair. I mean, obviously, what strikes you straight away when you look at the figures is, if you look at 3.3, is the fact that there was 268 applications in March, and obviously only 39 awards and 33 refused, and then when you look at May, the number of awards was 222, which obviously shows a big gap between when people were applying and when their actual calculation was done, and that's obviously an issue of concern, and I take on board what Lorna's saying now in terms of department seems to be on top of things, and the number of applications was higher than anticipated, but also it was quite a considerable wait. To begin with, I think this was an issue that the Labour Group particularly were concerned that the council weren't going to provide the sufficient numbers of staff. I mean, it's not criticism of the staff, the number of applications here and the number of staff, it's a huge pile of work for people, and we were concerned there wasn't going to be sufficient staff, and my worry is that that's kind of been proven correct, that there clearly wasn't sufficient staff in the process right at the very start. And I think if you look at the other grants as well, the crisis grants in particular, which is the one that concerns me most because the clue's kind of in the name, crisis grant, that is something that people need almost immediately when they apply for it, and when people are having to wait more than a couple of days, then frankly we're not dealing with the crisis in hand, and I think that's a real concern. And in particular, it's almost I take on board Lorna saying it, and we're now dealing with that almost in a couple of days, and hopefully the council has put the staff resource in there in order to allow that to happen. But there's almost a kind of hidden waiting list, if you like, because what people are doing is they're telephoning and they're leaving a message to then get a call back, and then there's a delay between leaving a message and then getting a call back. And at that point, that's not calculated in terms of the waiting time for an actual application, because until the information is provided, the application isn't live. But there is this time delay between leaving a message and getting a call back, in some cases as much as a week. And I think that's an issue of concern. People shouldn't have to wait that period of time. in order to get something that is a crisis grant, and I think that's an issue that concerns me. Another point is the actual amount of grants that we're allocating. I'll have a quick look at the table of other local authorities. Interesting to see Dundee don't even have a financial assessment at all, which is quite interesting. But we haven't really, although there's been a large number of discretionary housing benefit applications at the start, which you would expect because of the bedroom tax, and the numbers are obviously going to tailor off. We've actually got a substantial sum of money left in that particular budget, which would suggest that we're actually being incredibly strict when it comes to actually awarding grants. And I just wonder, as the number of applications tailor off, will we possibly revisit some of those applications on the basis of we probably have been quite strict and we've not actually handed out a huge amount of money so far, and we have a large amount of money left in that budget, and we aren't even spending up to the limit that we're entitled to do under the legislation. So I just wonder whether we're being incredibly strict. Maybe a future report or a future meeting of this committee, we could maybe get some worked examples. I'm not asking for a big pile of paper showing the examples, but if somebody could do some worked examples, obviously you can't reveal individuals' details, but you can reveal sort of figures showing how we actually calculate some of these, and I think that would be helpful to members. I've read the criteria twice, and I say well done to the staff for interpreting some of that stuff. But can we see some worked examples so we can see exactly how the criteria has been assessed? I mean, a simple thing, I can't work out why somebody maybe gets gets discretionary housing payment for 2 months and somebody else gets it for a longer period. It's difficult to actually pin that down from the actual criteria itself, so it'd be quite good to get that information in the future. But I'll come back to my main point. Seriously concerned about the time it was taken to deal with some of these applications, and I think obviously seek an assurance that the council and the department has given the team the staff resources needed to make sure that's not going to happen in the future. I think that's really important, and obviously as we perform a scrutiny role through Policy and Resources Committee, obviously things like how long it's taken to deal with applications needs to be built into the sort of performance criteria and KPIs that we actually use at Policy and Resources Committee.
Yes, there has been a recognition that initially, to deal with the volume of calls coming through, we couldn't handle the volume, so we introduced a callback system so that at least somebody would get the call handled and it would then put in place a callback. But then that escalated into we weren't making the callback within an acceptable time period. We have now put a new procedure and a new process in place where we can identify right from the outset that it is a crisis call, and they're prioritised for a callback. So now within the last week, all crisis calls are receiving a callback in the day that they'd actually make the call, so we can prioritise them. We have, through the call centre, actually got extra resources now going to be in place. The recruitment just went through last week. Those extra resources actually to deal with the calls rather than a callback will be is imminent to be in place. But as I said, the process of having it at this point in time means that people are actually getting a callback when it's a crisis. With regard to the DHP awards, I take on board the comments certainly that we're looking at how strict we are with the DHP and how we're awarding it. We monitor their spend on a weekly basis, basically. As I said, our award rate is currently just over 55% of those we have those who've applied we've actually made awards to. We do plan to go back and meet with the RSL specifically and talk to them about the tenants that are impacted, specifically around size criteria restrictions, and possibly relook at applications that we've said no to and relook at the criteria that why we've said no. Most of the no applications we're actually making at the moment is because of our assessment is initially a strict income and expenditure comparison. So we'll look at what somebody's income is, what they have in expenditure, and look at whether it's an affordable shortfall. And the most that we've gone back and said no to is because in the information we hold, they can't afford the shortfall. But we will be going back to RSLs and talking about how are these people actually managing, if they are, they're falling into rent arrears, what support can we put in place, if there needs to be budgeting advice or extra support from other areas put in place. We'll be going back and looking at these tenants with a view to make sure we maximise the expenditure that we have. And just the last point there about worked examples, that'll be no problem. We can bring that. If that's a requirement, we can bring back examples of cases where we've said yes to and why we're saying yes, and any examples of situations that no award has been made and why that's been done.
Thank you. Is that you?
I'm happy with that. I think the worked examples would certainly help me get my head around how we make particular decisions. I think revisiting it as something, or revisiting current clients that maybe had something rejected at the beginning, is something we're doing. Obviously, the big issues are the inconsistency through the process that we are actually, and I know that how difficult that will be to actually achieve, but actually making sure that we're consistent in that approach throughout the process. But it does seem that we are being quite tough, and I take on board what Lorna says, it's about the income. But it does seem we're being quite strict.
Councillor Geddes.
Thanks, Chairman. Paragraph 3.9, in particular, it makes reference to the pressures and how, in fact, that these have been dealt with thus far. You know, that the extra resources were moved from revenues to assist with processing and call handling. But further in the paragraph, Chairman, it talks about, in addition to the extra resources, staff have been increasing their hours of work to assist with the current situation. That's not tenable on a long-term basis. I'm assuming that that's a euphemistic way of saying that, you know, people are having to work overtime, etc. And that sort of thing. That really is, you know, to my mind, you know, sort of, and well, we ultimately know where that can lead. And my thrust of my question, Chairman, is we're being told that perhaps CCS staff elsewhere in Dumfries and Galloway are and this is not again meant to be suggesting for a moment that people are lying back with their feet up. Not in the slightest, but it's being suggested, in fact, that, you know, customers, for want of a better term, are choosing other ways, you know, to pay, and that there's a fall-off in business being transacted by certain CCS centres elsewhere. Now, if, and I stress if that is the case, is there no possibility of using that spare capacity, or possible spare capacity in a short-term, not to say urgency basis?
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and Councillor Geddes makes a good suggestion. I mean, one that we've already made some use of, certainly in terms of customer services staff from Anne, and right across the department, we've certainly looked, you know, with resources available to call on if we need to, and staff who can help out, and we certainly have during April in particular used resources in other parts of the department, and we'll continue to do that if necessary. And I think I'm right in saying, in terms, I think it's rather than not necessarily overtime sources of staff who are working part-time, potentially work increased hours, but obviously we're accommodating that from within existing budgets, so it's not sustainable on a long-term basis.
Chair. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Tracy. Can I be excused now, please?
Absolutely. It's 3.10. Is that still on track for the end of June? Okay. What the recommendations then? You won't have to be excused. 2.1 is to note the benchmarking information provided in relation to the allocation of discretionary housing payments funds. And 2.2 is to consider the performance information in relation to the administration of the Scottish Welfare Fund and discretionary housing payments.
Presumably, Chair, as we're updating the performance framework, whatever it's called, for the department, we obviously have to build these things in to the actual KPIs, you know, that people are getting a call back on the same day, that we're assessing crisis grants within 2 working days, etc., etc. That, I presume that will get built in and reported to the sort of Policy and Resources Committee in due course. So we're assured that the staff resource is being put in there.
Yes, I think that's a pretty helpful suggestion, Councillor Smith, and we've got our refresh business plan coming back to Policy and Resources Committee in July, so we'll pick up on that.
Thanks so much to all members and all staff. No further business. Thank you.